Makahanya haramita shingyo Genji saiboza gyojin hanya haramita jishoken gon gai gudo esai gu yaku shari shiki fui gu fui.
Chan Master Huang Po, also known as Obaku, was a native of Fujian. When still young, he left the home life at the Huang Po mountain monastery in his native province. He had a fleshy protuberance like a pearl in the middle of his forehead, and a clear and melodious voice. Once, wandering in the Tiantai mountains, he came across a monk with whom he chatted and laughed, as if they were old friends. Warmly regarding him, Huang Po saw that his eyes were bright and penetrating, and so they travelled together for a while. They were just approaching a mountain stream which had risen violently, so Huang Po gave up walking, took off his hat, planted his staff in the ground and made a stop. The monk wanted them both to cross the ford, but the master said, "If the elder brother wants to cross, then let him cross by himself." The monk then hitched up his robe and trod over the water as if it were solid ground. Turning his head, he shouted back to Huang Po, "Come across, come across." The master shouted angrily, "What? This self-enlightened fellow? If I had known this earlier, I would have chopped his feet off." The monk, sighing in admiration, said, "Truly a vessel of the great vehicle, something which I will not reach." Having said that, he wandered off, out of sight. This story features the great Zen master Obaku, to use his Japanese name. Huang Po is the Chinese name, and he's one of the few Zen masters to actually leave records of his words. You can find a collection of his sermons, the Record of Huang Po, which has been translated into English too. And Huang Po, or Obaku, also happens to be the teacher of Rinzai, or Lin Chi, to use his name. And Lin Chi died in the 9th century, so obviously Obaku crossed over that period, 8th, 9th century. This was all part of the great Tang Dynasty, which traditionally was viewed as the great golden flowering of Zen in China, when it really rose to its great height, or one of the periods of its great flowering. So Obaku is a very important figure, and this story, the encounter with the monk and the miraculous walking across the water, is a famous story and can be found in a number of places, such as in Wisdom of the Zen Masters as well, where it's retold. And here we find its original place, its original version, which is in the collection, the Records of the Transmission of the Lamp, which we've been looking at on the Zen Gateway over several months now. So the text introduces Huang Po, describes him, says that while still young he left the home life. And to leave the home life is a euphemism for meaning that he went to the temple and was ordained as a monk. And this is a tradition, obviously, that was founded by the Buddha himself. The monkish or monastic life, which obviously involved women and men, was a new innovation, in fact, for the Buddha. Obviously, there were sannyasins before, there were holy ones before in India, but having an organized sangha was something innovative, and in fact it was one of the few opportunities in India to actually escape both the caste system and also the gender roles as well. And because of this, it was always regarded with great suspicion. And in fact, when Buddhism moved through to China, there was an uneasy relationship because the family and the family network and the basis of the family in Chinese life was considered pivotal, as much, if not more, than in India. And it was very strict and extremely closely regimented and policed too. And for a long time, Buddhism, and for much of its history, was viewed with great suspicion. It was considered unorthodox because of this home leaving, because it meant that people would leave home and go off, and this was unheard of, really. The children played, as they grew older, they played an important role in the family, and the virtue of filial piety in China was raised to the highest virtue by Confucius, who was a contemporary of the Buddha. So, not without its controversy, this leaving home, but and hence why it became a euphemism for somebody who was becoming a monk. And as is quite usual, these masters often took the names of the mountains on which they founded their monasteries, or where they went to or if they took over a monastery. And Huang Po is the name of a mountain on which this monastery was built, and this is where Huang Po lived, and hence he took its name. And we're told it was a monastery on a mountain in his native province of Fujian as well. And it describes him. The record describes him, says he had a fleshy protuberance like a pearl in the middle of his forehead, and a clear and melodious voice. And we have to remember too that at this time, and for a long time, physical signs, physical traits, sometimes disabilities of one sort or another too, would be regarded as omens or markings that marked people out, especially. And clearly this fleshy protuberance, like a pearl in the middle of the forehead, would as well. I mean, obviously this notion of the Buddha's eye in the centre of the head, it appears in the scriptures, sometimes what's known nowadays as the third eye, but it actually has a symbolic meaning. Quite often in the texts, you'll come across a phrase, and certainly in both Obaku and Rinzai, that they will say, such and such, this must be read with a single eye. This must be read with the eye of the Dharma, or the single eye. And this single eye is contrasted with the two eyes that we have in our forehead. Of course, the two eyes reflect the opposites. And of course, that most basic of opposites is the opposite of I and other, me and you. And this duality, this dual view as it's known, was something that was tackled head on in the Mahayana teachings, with the teaching of shunyata, teaching of emptiness, which throws out this dualistic view, which pervades all our thinking. This is something that's a very profound and subtle teaching, because it really does pervade our thinking. If we look at the content of my thought, and in particular the view, the perspective that a lot of my thoughts are based on, we see that a lot of that thinking really does reflect these opposites. And people, great Indian sages like Nagarjuna and Vasubandhu, spent a long time negating these opposites, such as high and low, and life and death, and past and future. And when we read the text saying, give up, the pursuit of enlightenment, why? Surely that's what we're here for, to follow the Buddha's way. Well, yes, we are, but then we're told to give up the way too, because actually this all involves dualistic thinking, the idea that we have to go from a state of I to a state of no I, or a state of samsara to a state of nirvana, or a state, my present state, which I see as somehow imperfect, to some kind of perfected state. These are, within this, of course, all my ambitions lie. And all my ambitions also means that if my ambitions are thwarted and my plans are overturned, then the result is suffering, dukkha. But the feeling is, the inherent feeling is that unless I strive after something, then everything will come to naught. And of course, Buddhism simply doesn't see the human condition like this at all. In fact, this I and other, this dualistic thinking, this trying to attain something in the future rather than what is right here, right now, is seen as a false view, a deeply flawed view, because this is not how things come about at all. If we consider the universe itself, we know that it's roughly just under 14 billion years old, and it's never had an ambition in its life, and yet it's done all this, even producing us as well. And this is used particularly in Mahayana, and particularly in Chinese thought as well, this idea of nature, inherent nature, and that things unfold in accordance with that inherent nature, this inherent principle as it's sometimes called, or the Buddha nature, to use the technical term. This has absolutely nothing to do with I, and Chinese concepts such as Wu Wei or non-intentional action are based on this non-dual view of nothing to attain. And if there is something to attain, then there must be an attainer. And here we are with I again. I, the proverbial doer. I doing. I must meditate. I must be mindful. Actually, not at all. It's a very subtle but very important difference when it comes to practice. Instead of thinking I must sit down and meditate, actually not at all. I must give myself away into the meditating. I must give myself away into what at this moment's being done, the washing up or the ironing or the speaking or the listening, and if the mind wanders off into something else, as soon as that's caught, to once again not I must be more mindful, but I must give myself away back into the paying attention, into the listening, or whatever it actually is. It's a even just using that change of language has a quite a different nuance to it, and our practice is really to discover what that nuance is in actuality in our daily life. So, coming back, we have this fleshy protuberance that looks like this third eye, the single eye, this eye that sees the oneness in all things rather than the dual nature of seeing. And I suspect it doesn't say so here, but I suspect that this is its connotation. And of course, if we look at descriptions of the Buddha in the Pali Canon, it's said that Buddhas also have a number of marks, which we can look them all up. There were various sort of markings on the feet, for example, like the Dharma chakra, and the earlobes were considered very long, touching the shoulders, and there was instead of a protuberance in the middle of the forehead, there was one on the top of the head, and this is how you can recognize a Buddha statue and differentiate it from a bodhisattva. A Buddha statue always has what looks like a lump or top knot on the top of the head. This is a sign of a Buddha. And iconographically it's still so. So these were seen as signs, these were signs of special omens marking out that person. And as well as that, he also had a clear and melodious voice, which is probably rather good for a Zen master, as he's going to spend a certain amount of time speaking and teaching as well. Although saying that, actually, the incumbents, the masters, and even the roshis now, are often quite remote figures in the training places, certainly in Japan. They're quite remote figures. So in the training monasteries, there'll be a number of monks, and they will report to the head monk. And if you have a particular problem, or you need some wise counsel, it's not the roshi you see; it's the head monk. The only time that as an ordinary monk you would see the roshi would either be at the teisho, at the talk before the midday meal, and also in sanzen, in interview. And apart from that, you would rarely cross paths at all. And that's done intentionally because those personal relationships are actually avoided or minimized as much as possible for training purposes. And that clear and melodious voice reminds me also of another aspect of what we do, and also certainly what takes place in monasteries, and is actually very important for monks too, and that is the chanting. All Buddhist schools have some form of chanting, and the Zen school is no a stranger to that too. And each morning in Zen temples and monasteries, there's a long service, can vary between half an hour and an hour, made up of a number of different chants, and that chanting is done quite stylistically, and it's often done using what's known as a myokyo-ni, translated as a wooden fish, and it's a large wooden drum with a beater, and it goes bop 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 bop, and it sets the rhythm for the chanting. And the head monk usually will start off the chanting, and one of the other monks will do the myokyo-ni, bop bop bop, and then the head monk introduces each chant, and all the monks chant together. And chanting is a wonderful practice to do, actually. It's, I think, highly underestimated. Everybody seems to, in Buddhism, wants to practice meditation, and usually because that's that feeling that this is the good stuff, this is what makes the difference, and so on. Chanting is just seen as a sort of, religious act that we sort of have to do in between finishing the zazen, the sitting meditation, and being able to put our shoes on and go home. And that's a great shame, because all activities, of course, are meditation. And the thing about the voice is that it's a great revealer. It's a great revealer, and when people chant, the state of the heart is revealed through how that person does chant. Again, in the temples and monasteries, there's a middle way in the chanting, in the way that the chanting is done. On the one hand, obviously, it has to be wholehearted, and we learn to sort of really open up the chest, and not to just breathe from the top of the lungs, which is where most of us talk, but to really go from the bottom of the lungs. So one takes a breath in, the diaphragm pushes down, the stomach goes out, the lungs are completely filled, and then there's a droning sound put on, ho, and really open the throat up. The analogy that's usually used is eating a bowl of noodles. In the monasteries, it's quite there's no when the monks eat noodles, they slurp them down in huge mouthfuls. Probably not a very subtle thing, but that one has to open the throat out and swallow these hot noodles down as quickly as possible, and one can eat as many bowls of noodles as one wants. There's no restriction, but there's a limited amount of time in order to swallow them, and so rather like a dog wolfing it down, it's sort of and the liquid and the solids are all taken down, and to do that one really has to open the throat out, and that's the chanting throat. So the lungs full from the very bottom, and the throat is opened, and then the ho sound, that wholehearted open sound, that droning sound, and then onto that droning sound the syllables are placed. And the important thing with the chanting is chanting is not the same as speaking. Obviously, when I'm speaking, I'm chopping the sound with my lips in order to make the separate words. But in chanting, the whole thing goes together like a string of pearls. One pearl touches the next, the next, the next. And there's no space between them, although each pearl is distinct. And it's the same with the chanting. There's the drone sound, and the syllables then are placed on top, but there's no cutting of the syllable, no cutting of the drone. The drone is continuous, like a piece of rock, or a piece of carved rock. It can have lots of different carvings on it, but it's all one piece of rock, or one piece of clay or sculpture. So this is how that chanting is done, and there are lots of different sorts of chanting, and normally it starts off with the Repentance Sutra, which is one repents of everything, in fact, Normally we think about repenting of our failings, and indeed the literal translation of the Zangemon, which is the repentance, is about the turning over of and the letting go of all evil karma. But actually, I remember one Roshi saying, "But we must also repent of our successes too." The point being that we all want to get rid of our weaknesses and those things that show us up and our faults, but everybody wants to hang on to their successes. But he says, no. If we are really going to empty out, everything must go. Very typical Mahayana. And then after that is the chanting of the three refuges. I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha. And so we now, having emptied the heart out of I, we take refuge in the Buddha, his teachings, and the Buddhist community. After that, then there's usually the Heart Sutra, the Hanya Shingyo, which is the distillation, the essence of the Prajna Paramita Sutras, on the teaching of emptiness. And after that then come the what are known as the two Dharanis. The Dharani of protection, of avoiding disaster, and then the Dharani that invokes the great Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, or the Bodhisattva of compassion. And Dharanis are very much a Chinese. These were created by the Chinese. Dharanis are chants that have mantras in them, and so basically they're magic spells. And don't need to sort of go too much into that. Obviously people will no doubt have different views about that sort of thing, but it's useful. It reflects something. It's important not to just cast these things aside, even if one doesn't literally believe in them. Some people do, some people don't. I remember it struck me once. I remember once I was speaking to my mother when she was alive, and she was rather upset because she'd lost her address book, and this address book had all the addresses of everyone she'd ever known, and without it she would lose contact with a lot of people going right the way back to her college years, and so naturally it was a big loss for her. And about 2 or 3 weeks later, I was speaking to her again, and I said, any luck finding it? And she said, yes. She said, St. Anthony has never let me down yet. And my mother, well, originally coming from a Catholic background, of course, St. Anthony is the patron saint of lost items, finding to him that you pray for intercession in order to find lost items. And this petitionary prayer is this petitioning, invisible powers, is something that goes in all religions, actually. If you like, it's the practical application of a more abstract religious principles. And Buddhism's no different as well. People do pray to bodhisattvas or petition bodhisattvas for things. And I remember actually my own teacher saying, of course, in essence there's nothing wrong with this, she said, but there's one rule that must be followed, and that is that one may never pray or ask for something just for one's own benefit. It has to include all sides of the situation. And it was something that really struck me as well, because it requires a certain attitude to life. When in the case of my mother, for example, she had lost that item, and we know what it's like. In life we do lose control from time to time, because we cannot be totally in control about things. We cannot totally perfect things, no matter how we arrange our environment. And in the end, we're all going to grow old and die. Certainly we're all going to die anyway. So we don't control that. Although we may lengthen that life or shorten it, in the end we're all going the same way. And so there has to be the ability for the heart to be able to let go. And a little bit when one petitions in this way, that petition is not demanding. It cannot be, God, you must give this back to me, because one doesn't approach a deity like that. The deity represents the aspect of life which I do not control. These are the forces of nature outside of my control. These are the forces of nature that underpin my own existence, that bring me into the world and take me out of the world and rule everything in between as well. And when we lose something, then one of those forces has stretched out and taken something. And it's rather like if one is addressing someone of a much higher status or who has power over oneself. One doesn't act bolshy unless one wants to get very used to upsetting lots of people and then losing goodwill and then struggling to do even the ordinary things. So one really has to mind one's P's and Q's and make the right approach. And even if one has lost something like one's address book, you should say, St. Anthony, if you wouldn't mind, I know you're probably very busy, but if you wouldn't mind asking God, and I know, there's no reason why God should really care about my address book. It's nothing if you're looking after the whole universe, but, it really means a lot to me, and it would be a great shame because not only would I not be able to contact others, and that would upset me, other people would be upset because they would wonder why I'm no longer in contact with them. So for the good of all of us, myself and all those people, my friends in the address book, perhaps you could see your way to, that it should find its way back to me. And what that does, really, in one's own heart, is not only does it open it out from my problem, one begins to see one's own perspective, but also how this situation will affect others as well. It also leaves wiggle room for the possibility that it will not come back. And if it doesn't come back, then although it will hurt me, although I will be sad about it, I can't. There's a measure of acceptance in that petition already, an acceptance that it might not happen. I do want it to happen. I really want it to happen, but accept that it might not happen, and that's that openness. Psychologically is very important. Even if we don't want to take it any further than that, psychologically. It's very important because the fact that we are not in control of our own life is very important as well, and has to have that acceptance. And it's been worth dwelling on that question of the relationship between oneself and powers outside of oneself, because really the story of Obaku and the monk is really about that. It's about that relationship. It's about that acceptance. It's about that being able to relinquish control and go along with the circumstances, accepting that the circumstances we are in are as they are, and we must respect that. Anyway, so going on. Once wandering in the Tiantai Mountains, he came across a monk with whom he chatted and laughed as if they were old friends. Well, they're both monks, and wandering monks were quite a common place, and obviously if you meet up with somebody that you share something in common with, and obviously they did, it's rather nice. You've got something in common. As it says, when everyone sleeps under the same blanket, everyone knows where the holes are. Warmly regarding him, Huang Po saw that his eyes were bright and penetrating. The eyes, of course, we have that saying that the eyes are the windows of the soul, and indeed they are. One sees in the eyes the state of the heart. One can smile, but if the eyes are not smiling, then the heart is not necessarily in it. Anyway, with this one, his eyes were bright and shining and penetrating, so they travelled together for a while. They were just approaching a mountain stream, which had risen violently. Presumably there had been some heavy rain further upstream. So Huang Po gave up walking, took off his hat, planted his staff in the ground and made a stop. Presumably he was going to just wait until, because they were at a ford, but presumably with the risen water level, the ford would not be usable. It would be too dangerous. And so one stays where one is, and one simply has to wait and wait for the excess water to run away. And once the river levels have gone down in a few hours, maybe the following day, then one can safely cross over the ford to the other side, and one can continue on that way. And in this way, it's going in accord with things as they are. And again, we need to be careful, because we're not talking about being doormats in everyday life, but we're also talking about developing a sensitivity, a feel for situations, not always imprinting myself onto a situation or demanding that things should change as to how I want them to be, and then getting short-tempered or impatient in order to get my own way. And of course, this is the thing with the passions as well. This is the danger with the passions. That the passions themselves are living. They are living beings. I mean, in fact, they are portrayed as such on the Wheel of Life. Asuras are fighting demons, and hungry ghosts are hungry ghosts. These are living beings, and our own heart mind is transformed by them. And we use our emotional household in order to, or we've learned to use our emotional household in order to get what we want. Some of us know that most people don't like conflict. So if I throw a hissy fit and bang the table, most people don't like that and are prepared to give me what I want. And if I learn early on that is so, I can consciously use it in order to get my own way. So it's me first. But the thing is that whilst it starts off that I am now using my anger as a tool, as an instrument to get my own way, what I don't realise is that by continued habitual practice, that temper really does begin to grow. It begins to take on a life of its own, and it becomes autonomous. And the corollary of that is that my own bearing strength, my own ability for patience, my own ability to bear not having my own way, atrophies, it becomes reduced. And this means that because the more I want something, the more hotly I want something, the more afraid I become if I cannot get it. So those two things go together. Those are another match pair. The more that I hotly desire something, the more afraid I become if I can't actually get it. And so this is always the danger in always stamping my own will onto things. I mean, yes, we can have our own way when circumstances allow, but in the practice we learn to gauge it. This is why we practice restraint. You know, people sometimes say, oh, you know, when you're in the monastery, you've got those rules to follow, and you can't do this and you can't do that. And it's true at first, it's irksome. It's rather like going into the Zendo. One has to put their hands in a certain way, and if you don't bow at the right place, somebody will tell you off for it, and no one likes to be told off. But one learns to bear those things. But, you know, to an outsider, you think, oh, why do you just, if you're just going to meditate, why don't you just sit down and meditate? You know, all this nonsense. But actually, this form really helps us because we have to learn to let go. And meditation is all about learning to let go. It's that relinquishing of I and then handing myself over into the object of meditation. That's what brings about the state of meditation. To say again and again, and I will not tire of saying it, I cannot meditate. I can only give myself into the meditating. That is it. That is the way it goes. So here we are. Huang Po, having put down his hat and planted himself down, makes a stop. The monk, however, he wanted them both to cross the ford. He was not going to wait. And so he hitched up his robe and then trod onto the water as if it was solid ground. So this is the walking across the water. Although it appears outwardly to be a similar miracle to one we find in the New Testament, please let's be very clear about this, that the motivation for the two of them are completely different. And in Buddhist practice, motivation, not the action, is what's the decisive thing. Karmically, it's the motivation behind the action that creates the karmic outflows, not the action itself. So two people can do the same action, but they can have two very different karmic consequences if those motivations are different. And in this one, there was nothing holy about it at all. It was simply that he wanted to cross the water, and he could do it because he had the supernormal powers in order to do it, and he wanted to go. He didn't want to wait. But as far as Obaku was concerned, this cuts right across the situation. It's something that has the wrong feel to it altogether. It was through impatience, or whether it's through pride or through showing off or boasting or whatever it might be. It's all about I, really. After all, what's the hurry? There's nothing wrong. They were enjoying their conversation. They can now sit down and they can rest and just wait for the water to go. But no, I must go. I want to get on my way, and that's the rub here. And so quite naturally, when Obaku rebuked him, the master shouted at him angrily, "What? This self-enlightened fellow, this one who thinks he's enlightened, but actually he's made himself the judge of this." And this is actually, I'm not going to go too much into this, but this is something that's very important too, because whenever there's an insight, it has to be compared to the teachings, and normally that's done through the teacher. So one goes to the teacher, the insight is shown, and the teacher will say yes, usually will say no, and that means the student has to go away and dig a little bit deeper. But so this is quite a rebuke. This self-enlightened fellow, if I had known this earlier, I would have chopped his feet off. In other words, we would not be walking the same way at all. We wouldn't have set out together. The monk, sighing in admiration, so he seems to have had a change of heart, said, "Truly a vessel of the great vehicle." That great vehicle, of course, is the Mahayana, the Great Way. Something which our eye will not reach. And no, he's right. No eye can reach that great vehicle. It's only when that eye is laid down that the Great Way appears. Having said that, he wandered off and out of sight. And with that, I think for now we'll leave that.
Yate hara so yate boji so aka anya shin gyo